תודה רבה רותי, תודה על כל העבודה שלך, לא רק לארגן את הכנס היום, אבל כל העבודה שאנחנו עושים יחד. זה באמת בשבילי ולצוות שלי והטים, כמו שאני אומרת, שיש לי ב-State Department, זה הנאה לעבוד איתך ועם הקולגים שלך. ולמיניסטר כהן, תודה רבה על המילים, דברים היוצאים מן הלב נכנסים ללב, וכך זה היה. תסלחו לי שאני אדבר באנגלית. I'm going to talk in English. As I like to say, my Hebrew may be okay for thank yous, but when it comes to professional matters, I don't have certain terms that work in Hebrew that I do have in English, and the example I always use is nuance. I don't know how you say nuance in Hebrew, but I was told nuance, so, but, and I also want to pay particular attention to the work of Michal Kotler-Wunsch, who has just only entered office recently in extremely difficult days, but your enthusiastic work on this topic has really been felt and been heard. And again, the way you speak from the heart has entered the hearts of many people. I'm going to step back from the exact topic, which we'll really cover and address in the excuse me, panel itself, and step back and try to set a context for some of the issues we will be discussing. I'm cognizant of the fact that tonight is the final night of Hanukkah, a festival of lights, and for this country, these have been very dark days. I've been here before. As a very young girl, I was here in 1967. I was moved to past the National Library, the magnificent new National Library, because I was one of the last groups to study at Givat Ram. And I was here in June 1967, and they needed help cleaning up Har HaTzofim for the concert, the famous concert of Leonard Bernstein. And so they sent a bus to pick us up. And the bus driver didn't have a number. It was one day after the war, I think the war had ended. So he took a 6 and he put it upside down, because if some of you may know, it was line 9, I believe, that used to go up to Har HaTzofim. And the place I was assigned to clean up was the National Library up there, and now you have a new National Library here. So it sort of took me through my own personal history. But having said that, when I came into office, approximately a year and a half ago, one of my main foci, one of my main objectives was to work on what you in Israel call Heskemei Avraham, the Abraham Accords. I did so because that was one of the things that compelled me to say I'm going to give up my very comfortable academic position to go into the world of diplomacy, which is a whole other world. Because in terms of, when working on anti-Semitism, which I've done for decades, rarely does one have a chance to do something affirmative. Rarely does one have to do something positive. Rarely does one get the chance to address the issue not of Jew as object, but of Jew as subject. Not what is done to Jews, but what Jews do. And here was a chance to do something. Naturally, in terms of my portfolio, it was less involvement in the intricacies of the foreign relations between Israel and these Muslim-majority countries, but certainly in addressing the anti-Semitism which had been present in many of these countries, whether officially or unofficially, and stressing the fact in these countries, Saudi Arabia, which was not yet part of the Abraham Accords, UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, to talk about the fact that Jews were indigenous to the region. And throughout that first approximately year and a half, I made numerous trips to these countries. And many of them had many powerful experiences. Since I know some of you have Moroccan roots, I was deeply touched on my first day in Casablanca I was visiting the Grand Mosque, and as we were going into the building, I heard a woman speaking Hebrew to the person she was with. I assume it was her husband, I don't know, but they were talking Hebrew. So I said in Hebrew, At me Aretz, are you from Israel? And no, I said, are you At me Morocco? And she said, no, Safta. Safta is from Meknes, came from Morocco. I said, so you've never been here? She said, no. And I'll say in Hebrew what she said to me, Aval hamakom hazeh medaber li lalev. This place speaks to my heart. And there really was a hope for furthering and strengthening and building the relationship. One of the great worries of the Moroccan government was how was it going to have enough kosher meat to satisfy all the Israeli tourists that it expected in the coming year. Some of those things have been put on hold, but our hope is, and my government's hope is, and I know many of the governments here, and certainly is I believe Israel's hope, is that it is temporarily put on hold, that things will yet move forward in a very positive way. But there is the giant monster in the room, and that is, of course, anti-Semitism. And in addition to having worked certainly till October 7th on moving forward on the Abraham Accords, on getting some of these countries to acknowledge and to recognize and to teach about Jews being indigenous to these countries and indigenous to this region, much of my work, up until October 7th and even more so now, has been addressing the demonization of Jews and legitimizing, certainly in Muslim-majority countries, the notion of Jewish peoplehood, both in upper levels, governmental levels, and in terms of grassroots initiatives. While the current situation has aroused passions and allowed some political actors to revert to the hateful rhetoric that we saw for so many decades, I am, as I noted earlier, my government is, and I believe, again, as I said earlier, that the leadership here in Israel, the Israeli government, is cautiously optimistic, if not more than cautiously optimistic, that this can be renewed. What we've seen, but before anything like that can be renewed, we have to address what has happened since October 7th in terms of anti-Semitism. And before October 7th, I used to speak about a spike, and then as some things got a little worse, I used to talk about a surge. Now I don't do that. I talk about a tsunami of anti-Semitism. It's been approximately 2 months since the war, and we've seen Holocaust memorials vandalized in Canada, France, Greece, Denmark, and the United States. We've seen Molotov cocktails thrown at synagogues in Berlin and Montreal. A synagogue in Tunisia was burned to the ground. Another one in Yemen was attacked by arsonists. We've seen Jews peacefully protesting on the streets of European and American cities physically abused. Jewish schools fired upon. In parts of Latin America and South Africa, certain political actors have reverted to irresponsible, contemptible anti-Semitic rhetoric. However, there is some, shall we say, good news in this bleak situation. And since October 7th, I have been in Rome. I was there when the war began. I have spoken to officials in Rome. I've spoken to officials Vatican, Paris, Germany, Canada, and then in the United States with many of the representatives of other countries, particularly European countries. And what I can say, and Israelis might describe this as chatzi nechama, half a consolation, that many of these governments are taking the issue of anti-Semitism very seriously. And they're taking the issue of anti-Semitism very seriously for a number of reasons. First and foremost, generally, in terms of protection of a vulnerable community in their midst. And this is especially so on the European continent, where there are small Jewish communities, not by natural attrition, but because of a tragedy of the Shoah. But they're also taking it very seriously because many of them have come to recognize, and we're hoping more so do, and we're hoping not only the leaders, but the general populace, media, et cetera, will recognize that anti-Semitism is, as I mentioned a moment ago, of course it's a threat to Jews. And were it just a threat to Jews, it would be a worthwhile thing to fight. Because in many essence, and I'm boiling this down, I know there are legal representatives of countries who might cringe in my analogy, but on some level, a government's job is to act in loco parentis, not to children, but to the communities, the people in its midst. And just as parents pay special attention when they have special needs children, so government should pay special attention when there are communities that are vulnerable. Not special needs because they are weak, but vulnerable to attack. And that is the job of governments to do. So for that alone, anti-Semitism would be a valid thing to be on the agenda, the domestic agenda of any country. However, I think it's really important to recognize that anti-Semitism is more than just, and I put just in quotation marks, more than just that. It is also a threat to democracy. Why is it a threat to democracy? Because the person who is an anti-Semite has bought into the conspiracy myth, not conspiracy theory, it's not a theory, it's a myth, the conspiracy myth that Jews control media, government, judges, elections, banks, control everything. And if you believe that Jews control everything, then essentially you've given up on democracy. So the anti-Semitic myth, the anti-Semitism and the conspiracy myth that goes with it is a threat to democracy. But there's something else as well. And this was evident before October 7th, but anybody who had any doubts about it, they should have been dispelled since October 7th, that we see anti-Semitism, and I know the INSS has looked at this in this regard as well, as a threat to national security, international stability. That there are bad actors in this world, countries, NGOs, individuals, who recognize that anti-Semitism is like a cooking spoon that stirs up the pot, stirs the pot of stability. That anti-Semitism, for the Yiddish speakers amongst you, a kochlöffel, you would say, stirring up the pot. They are, as some of us like to talk about, it's utilitarian anti-Semitism. It's not anti-Semitism by conviction. Some people at least really believe in what, I mean, it's crazy to say that, but at least they believe in their anti-Semitic ideology. But others, and then of course at the other end of the spectrum, there are those who adopt it but don't understand what they're adopting, as we've seen on some of these protests when people have been asked what they're chanting, they don't know which river, which sea, they don't know exactly what it's all about. But so you have, those two spectrums, but you also have in the midst those who would use anti-Semitism as a means to further their ends. And in this case, their ends would be destabilizing other countries. Destabilizing countries by any means possible. So if I can begin to introduce anti-Semitism, whether it's paying people to paint Jewish stars on homes and apartment buildings that house Jews, or to demonstrate, or to cause disruption to Jewish institutions, it works in my benefit. So I think that it's very important in addressing this topic, recognizing that we're not just talking about the welfare of a particular community, but we're talking about something far larger, far more expansive. And I have seen in my travels, as I mentioned earlier, that increasingly, certainly European governments recognize this. Maybe not as much as they should, but it is something that is exceptionally important. And since October 7th, that's really been the focus of much of my work and my team at the State Department. I'll give you an example. We've seen expressions of anti-Semitism on Chinese-controlled, Chinese-owned social media platforms, and you have to ask, what's going on here? And it's hard to understand it without seeing it in this fashion as a way of destabilizing the West. And I don't mean only China, but it's just one example which sort of blatantly illustrates the problem. My country, the Biden administration, and the Congress, and rarely in my country in these days can you speak about bipartisan issues. I think that's more and more a word that is too rarely used in many countries, but there is a bipartisan commitment to fighting anti-Semitism. And I think it is exceptionally important that we stress, no matter what country it is, America, other European democracies, and even Israel, and I say this quite specifically, the fight against anti-Semitism cannot become a political weapon. In my hearings before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, because as an ambassador I had to be nominated by the President, confirmed by the Senate, one of the questions that was asked to me is, do I see anti-Semitism from the left? Which do I think is more dangerous, from the left or from the right? And I said, I don't do equations of what's more dangerous. They're both dangerous in their own fashion. And I pointed out to the senator who was asking me this, I told him that I have friends on the left who see the anti-Semitism on the right, Charlottesville, Poway, AFD, and various other countries, and what they're seeing is very accurate. They are seeing what is really there. And conversely, I have friends on the right who see anti-Semitism on the left, and what they see, they are very accurate. They are not neither side is exaggerating one whit. They recognize the problem, they analyze the problem, their analysis is compelling, and generally their analysis of its existence accurate. The problem is, many of them do not see it right beside them. They only see it on the other side of the political transom. And in that sense, they are weaponizing. You have to ask, are you only interested in it as a political weapon to beat up on people on the other side of the transom? Or are you interested in the issue in and of itself? And I would urge that we recognize this, going back to my initial comments, of this as an international danger, and how important it is not to let the fight against anti-Semitism become politically weaponized. It is an affront to the integrity of our laws, it is a gateway to prejudice, to racism, and it is a destabilizer. We've seen, and I know my time is short, so I'm going to bring this to a conclusion, but we've seen, how someone asked me recently, a fellow diplomat, why would protesters go to a Jewish restaurant, kosher restaurant, Israeli-style restaurant in Philadelphia, and protest what is going on there? What's the connection? Why would they protest in front of a synagogue? It shows that much of the opposition, people taking political opposition to Israel, just see all Jews as responsible. It's the overflow of the anti-Semitism related to this particular war, this particular crisis, and it becomes either an excuse for an expression of their anti-Semitism, or it becomes, in their minds, it's all the same. We've watched people pull down posters of hostages with glee. Not just pull down the posters, but do it joyfully. You have to ask, what is that about? We have students sometimes afraid to go to universities if there is a demonstration. Is it safe to go? I've heard this story in too many places. And it's not, we used to say, for many of my predecessors were able to come to settings like this or go to other countries and say, you have a problem, I can't do that. We have a problem, we have the problem in the United States as well. So in conclusion, conscious and unconscious anti-Semitism has bled into the thinking of too many people. The story of Jews in Arab lands, Jews who trace their history back to Muslim-majority countries, is particularly important, because part of this anti-Semitic story is, of course, Jews as white, Jews as privileged, Jews as Western, and we know that is not the case. Our fight against anti-Semitism is going to be a long one. It is baked into the DNA of the world's culture in a way that no other prejudice is baked into it. But for the welfare and the well-being of our societies, it is something we must address. So I am very grateful to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to the Minister of the Foreign Minister, to INSS, and to all of you for being here for this important discussion. Thank you very much.